As I was saying, we there was this. I got this general impression that people think that Jewish people just went along with the Germans, and they were lambs to the slaughter. And in many cases, that might be true. At least it appeared to be. And the reason being, hang on. Hello, Anne. Okay. I just let Anne Neuer in.
Hi,
Anne. Hi there. I was just starting. So as I was saying, that in many cases that was the case because civilian populations were unarmed, and so when the Germans marched into a town, began shooting anybody who resisted at all. Then there wasn't a lot of resistance, and in a lot of situations, resistance was almost pointless. And so once you got packed onto, and I should add, the Germans use a lot of deception. So people were told they were being relocated when they were being sent to a death camp. They were even told to pack your belongings along. When you got to the death camp, they were told they were being taken for showers, and their luggage would be brought to them afterwards. So there was a lot of deception along the way. And anyone who resisted at all was shot on sight. So at certain points, there was no point to resist because it just meant instant death. So in fact, the conclusion I made was the best way to resist often was to stay alive, because that tied up German resources to look after you, or at least watch over you. But there were many people who fled from the towns and the cities and went into the forest and joined resistance movements and resisted, but it was mostly young people. So if you were a mother with 2 young children, you're not going to run into the forest and leave your kids. Grandparents, what are they going to do? They didn't have. There was no way that they could resist. But there were instances where there was real resistance, and that's some of the things I sort of just want to sort of talk about a short time. And maybe the first one, I'll give you an example. There were many attempts to escape, even the concentration camps. And I can give, for an example, in Auschwitz, there were 928 people who escaped Auschwitz. Most of them were caught. And when you were caught, if you were actually brought back alive, you were hung in the main assembly grounds for everybody to see as a warning. And in some cases, for retribution, they might, for every person who escaped, they might shoot 20 people, just as a warning. But I can tell you that there were 196 successful escapes from Auschwitz alone. So, I'm sorry?
Sorry, okay. That was me. Sorry, I'm sorry.
Okay. But there were actually very specific uprisings that occurred. And I'm going to talk about a couple of them. The best known one was the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, which began on April 19th, 1943. And in fact, that was what I would say is the first major uprising of any kind. And for quite a number of months, the Jewish underground was smuggling in arms. And it was that day when the Nazis entered the ghetto to deport what remained of the inhabitants, and I'm trying to remember the number now, but it might have been something like 40,000 people were still. At one time, there were about 500,000 Jews crammed into the ghetto, which was quite small. I was last August in Warsaw, and I couldn't believe how tiny it was. The part that was the ghetto, and the Jewish resistance had about 700 young fighters who were armed with smuggled weapons, and they started fighting back, caught the Germans by surprise, and the resistance actually lasted 27 days. The SS, in response, in order to deal with it, basically just leveled the ghetto. They just block by block, they just razed every building. People, in many cases, people died in burning buildings, and in fact, about half of them probably died from smoke inhalation. The remainder were shot by the Nazi troops, but the resistance didn't really have that much impact on the Nazis themselves. They reported about 110 casualties, and considering, in all things considering, that's not a lot, but it was really the first case where such an uprising occurred. And that followed, there were several other ghettos that had uprisings as well. And part of the reason is that some of the fighters in Warsaw, in the Warsaw ghetto, left before the fighting ended and began organizing and basically filtered out the different ghettos in Poland and began organizing resistance. And in fact, one of the main organizers in Warsaw, her name was Fiumia Plotnica, and she escaped, and she used false identity, traveled around Poland, and she ended up in my dad's hometown of Będzin. And when that ghetto was being liquidated in August of the same year, she organized resistance. They didn't have quite the arms that they had in Warsaw, and basically the fighters there, after 3 days, ran out of ammo, and then the Germans just basically destroyed the bunker that they were in. And interesting, the Germans were so upset about the uprising that when they captured those who were remaining, because the fighting basically extended beyond when they had liquidated the ghetto, when they were brought to Auschwitz, they didn't even take them to the gas chamber because they were too concerned. They actually just shot them out on the train platform. The next case was early in 1943, and I should go back. There were the Nazis had actually set up 4, what I would say, killing centers, and they were in Belzec, Chelmo, Sobibor, and Treblinka. Those 4 were basically, that was following the 1C conference where they finalized the plans for exterminating all the Jews. So they set up these 4 extermination camps. So anybody there who was sent there was killed immediately. Other than those who were assigned to herd people into the gas chambers and then take the bodies out, and then where they were then, the bodies were then either buried or burned. The other camps that where there was gassing and was Auschwitz, Birkenau, and Majdanek. So those were concentration camps and extermination camps. They were originally not extermination camps, but they added gas chambers there in 1942. So I'd say in March of 1943, the Germans began to plan to erase all evidence of mass murder at Treblinka. Oh, yes. And just let someone else in. So, the prisoners were actually forced to open up mass graves and burn the corpses, because at a certain stage, the Germans decided they didn't want any evidence of what they were doing. So, as the work neared completion, the prisoners became concerned that they were going to be killed as well, and the camps dismantled. And so resistance leaders at the camp decided to revolt. So on August of 43, prisoners seized weapons from the camp armory and tried to take over the camp. They stormed the main gate, and basically a lot of them were mowed down by machine gun fire, but more than 300 did escape, and many were recaptured, and following which the camp was totally dismantled and burned down. So there's really nothing there now other than a memorial. So that was the first camp where there was an uprising. Several months later, in October 43, in Sobibor, which was another extermination camp, word got to them eventually that what had happened in Treblinka, and they began to realize that at some point the camp was going to be dismantled and they were all going to be killed. When I say they, it's those prisoners that weren't being liquidated but were being used by the Germans to assist them in killing people being brought in every day. And in fact, part of what fed this is in the summer of 43, the number of people being shipped to Sobibor began to drop off considerably. They usually sent Jews from the ghettos in the region, and as the region began to eliminate those Jews in that region, there were fewer and fewer available that they could send. So at a certain point, rumors started to spread that they were going to be liquidated just like those in Treblinka. And so a group of Polish Jews led by a man named Leon Feldhandler, no relation to me, formed a committee to try and plan a mass escape. Except that the problem was that nobody knew, and nobody had any military experience and really didn't know how to organize it. And then what happened was, at some point, I think it was probably about a month later, a number of Jewish Red Army POWs were sent to the camp. And one of them he was, I think, a lieutenant. His name was Alexander Perchesky. He took over and began to work out a plan. And they had this plan. It was in two phases. They were going to, they decided they were going to kill as many of the officers in the camp as they could. And they had this elaborate plan on the day they were going to execute it, that they worked out where the officers would be. For instance, there was a tailor in the camp who was making a coat for one of the officers, so that he arranged for a fitting on that morning, and so on and so forth. There were all these. They had worked out all these elaborate plans where they could corner all the officers, and they had smuggled out axes and hammers from workshops that they were going to use to attack them. The plan, and once they had them all killed, or as many as they could, they were going to take their uniforms and pretend and sort of and try and get out through the main gate using people disguised as the officers. It didn't really go as well as planned because they didn't end up killing as many officers as they wanted to. The timing just didn't work out for them. But during what was supposed to be the second phase, about 600 prisoners just stormed the gate. They were being shot on by machine guns by the guards. But there was a mass escape, and about 300 prisoners did get out of the camp. Now the camp was surrounded by landmines, and many of the people escaped were blown up. But about 100 were recaptured. They were shot, and over 100 did end up escaping, and 60 actually survived the war. And I'll talk about this a little later, but there's, because there's some films and books, and a lot of it came from the testimony of the survivors themselves. Now, and of course, right after that happened, that camp was also dismantled, and any trace of the extermination were removed. Now, the most interesting one uprising occurred at Auschwitz, and was this one is one I know them best because I had family members who were in the camp at the time, and they actually knew some of the organizers. The uprising was actually orchestrated by women in the women's camp, and a couple of weeks ago, or maybe it was last week, I actually went to visit the last remaining survivor in my family, my cousin who's 95, and and her short-term memory isn't very good, but she does remember her life in Auschwitz, and she confirmed some of this as well to me. But there was a plan to there was a plan developed to blow up the crematorium, all the crematoriums in Auschwitz, and I guess I know some people have sort of questioned, why did they choose the crematorium? They could still gas people. Why not the gas chambers? Well, the whole idea was to slow down the killing as much as they could, and in Auschwitz, I believe the gas chambers could accommodate about 2,000 people a day. That's right. But the crematorium, they could only, if they're going 24/7, accommodate about 1,000 a day. So they could slow down the killing by blowing up the crematorium. Much more. So if you knocked out one gas chamber, they still could kill. They could still kill. They could. It would not slow down the killing because gas chambers were not in full capacity. And so the plan in Auschwitz was, and as I mentioned, the key players were actually female Jewish prisoners, and some of them were actually from my father's hometown. So that's when I questioned my cousin about it. She had mentioned that she even went to school with one of them, and these women, a number of them, they're around Auschwitz were a number of factories. And that's why it was a concentration camp as well as extermination camp, because quite a number of prisoners were assigned forced labor. And there was a munition plant right part of Birkenau, and some of the women in there began to smuggle out small quantities of gunpowder, because they were making bombs, and they would have little pouches that they would hide in folds of clothing, and they were quite clever about it, and they were searched. There were frequent surprise searches, and what they would do is, if they felt that they were going to be discovered, they would just pull out the pouch that they might be carrying and empty it onto the ground and just rub it into the dirt so you wouldn't even notice it. So that's how they were never discovered. And what they would do is they would hand it over to this Russian munition expert who was going to make bombs to blow up all the crematorium. Unfortunately, the plan kind of went off the rails. One day, there was word was leaked out that in crematorium number 4, the Sonderkommandos were going to be replaced. Usually, replacement meant that they were going to be killed, and then new Sonderkommandos were going to be brought in. They did not. You did not last very long as a Sonderkommando. It was like 3-4 months, 6 at the most, and then they would just replace you because they would be sent to the gas chambers because they did not want any witnesses to mass murder. And so when word got out that they were going to be replaced, the Sonderkommandos decided at that point they were going to rebel. And so what happened is it was never coordinated. Others in the camp didn't even know that there was an uprising taking place. And they grabbed one of the SS guards, one guy that he was a very sadistic guard, and he was thrown alive into one of the crematorium. Then they got a makeshift bomb and blew it up. Well, they didn't actually blow it up, but they did enough damage to it to take it out of commission. And then, excuse me, the Sonderkommandos rushed the fence. Somebody had smuggled out from one of the factories a pair of shears, rubber with rubber handles, so you could cut the electrified wires, and about 250 prisoners escaped. Unfortunately, they were all killed. They were all caught and they were all killed. And then on top of it, the SS shot another 200 people as a reprisal. I believe, I'm trying to remember, I believe about several, there were a couple guards killed and several were injured, but they didn't really do much damage other than slow down slow down some of the killing. And I should add, at this point, the Germans already knew that this camp was going to be abandoned shortly because the Russian troops were rapidly advancing. But the Germans never slowed down the killing, even though they were losing the war. In fact, in some cases, they sped it up. And they began searching the barracks. And my cousin told me that they ripped apart the barracks because they were looking for more gunpowder. One of the women who was organizing it, her name was Esther Weisblum. She and her sister, her younger sister, actually, was who my cousin knew, and her name was Anna. And one of them, the leader, one of the leaders was betrayed by a woman named Alla Gertner. She had confided in an SS officer who she had befriended and actually thought she could trust. And so 4 women were picked up and sent, and they basically tortured for months. They gave up nobody. They didn't give up any names except for people they knew who were already killed. And so eventually, I guess when they couldn't get anything out of them, they were hung. They were actually hung in January 5th, approximately 2 weeks before the camp was evacuated. So it was just they were hung in front of all the women in the women's side, and the whole time they basically gave up no one's name. Now, that younger sister Anna, she was interviewed extensively after the war. She has a book out, and so she actually wrote a diary in Bergen-Belsen after she was liberated, and recalled all these events, and in, I believe, in 1991, she released a memoir, and a lot of this stuff is detailed in that memoir. There's also a film about the Auschwitz uprising. It came out in 2001. It's called The Gray Zone, and it actually is extremely accurate. Of course, there were a few films about the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, and Leon Uris's fictional novel Mille 18 does a great job. But there's also an autobiography by Jack Eisner called The Survivor. And then there are several books and movies about Sobibor uprising as well. There's an 1987 film called Escape from Sobibor. And there was also a Russian film, 2018, also called Sobibor. So what I sort of want to do is kind of like open it up now, and people had comments or questions they wanted to add to that. I'm just going to unmute. Anybody have any comments or anything?
Yeah, Willie. The interesting thing is that the Sobibor uprising, the way you describe it, or I mean the way you describe it, but the way it's depicted, you remember the mini-series The Holocaust that aired for the first time in 1978. I think a lot of people on the call will remember that.
Yeah, because everybody's old.
At the end of that film, or near the end of that film, there's a scene where the Joseph Bottoms character is in a camp, and there's an uprising, and they escape, And the way they escape was the way you described the Sobibor uprising was depicted, where he's in a camp with some Russians, and they attack the guards with hammers and axes and stuff like that. But obviously, it's not the same because he's not in a, it's much later in the war. But it's interesting because they used the information that's depicted in the Sobibor uprising for him to escape.
Now, I actually rewatched that TV series last year.
Oh yeah,
and I'm pretty sure they did say it was Sobibor.
Oh really? Okay.
Yeah. No, and I mean there was the characters themselves were fictionalized, of
course,
in the series, but not the events.
Mm-hmm.
And so they actually that was supposed to be Sobibor. Okay. And the same thing, they showed Bobby Yar in that series.
Right.
So some of the characters were fictionalized, but the events were relatively accurate. Anybody else?
I have a question. When you started out, you said that many people thought that Jews did not rise up against the Nazis. Who were the people that thought that? Were they other Jews or were they Germans trying to, cover up what was happening?
That was really the sentiment in Israel post-war, because the mentality of an Israeli is you never give up, give in. That you fight to the bitter end, and so they could not understand why they would allow themselves to be, to allow themselves to be killed without resisting at all. But the Israelis, their fighting forces are people. They're all young people. They don't even send women to the front. Not until recently they haven't. Certainly not old people. So that was a perception, I think, in the 50s, and I think over time it's changed a bit. But that was just a very cavalier attitude from those Israeli pioneers, and many of them were not. Most of them were. They had emigrated to Palestine before the war, so they were quite distant from it. I mean, I have family as well who ended up in Israel before the war, fortunately, or Palestine at the time. But it's actually, the accusation came from other Jews more than anything else.
Well, actually, too, I've even heard it far more recently, but it's usually been, say, on Twitter or Facebook or whatever, in which they're saying these people, if they'd only had guns, they would have killed everybody and saved themselves, or they were just cowards and they just let the Germans kill them. And I've seen that a lot, actually.
Yeah, there's not a good understanding of how powerful of a fighting force the German army was at the start of the war. They overran Poland in a matter of days.
Yes.
The Polish had the cavalry against tanks. And so, in fact, my father's hometown of Benzin, they marched in on September 4th with no resistance. Not Polish resistance or Jewish resistance, because how could you resist? Nobody had that kind of power to resist them at all. And I think people today don't understand what people were up against at the time.
I think also, Willie, until the Nazis, I mean, there was never an idea that an entire population would be systematically murdered. I mean, it just wasn't part of people's thought processes. I mean,
No.
yes, there was anti-Semitism, but I don't think anybody in their wildest imagination could have expected that this, the Nazis would plan, mass murder on such a vast industrial scale. And so in a way, I think people weren't prepared for that. I mean, they just couldn't imagine that, it didn't even enter into their imagination that such a thing could occur, right?
Yeah, I mean, in the 30s, there was a propaganda war against Jews. Many of the anti-Semitic tropes were dragged out. They were blamed for every bad thing in the world, the recession, Germans' defeat in World War I, you name it. They were blamed for it. But for European Jews, that's the norm. There was cycles of anti-Semitism, for centuries. And so there would be a bad period, then things would get a little bit better, and then bad. And so no wonder they thought, well, we're just good. This is going to be just a really rough time for a while. Nobody contemplated. You're right. And nobody thought that they were going to set up factories in Sobibor and Belzec and Treblinka specifically to murder people. And they were very efficient about it. And you think about how important this was, that they were using SS troops, using train transportation during a war, used to basically to liquidate a whole part of the population. It's just a bizarre thing, and it's still hard for people to believe. Which I kind of maybe that feeds into some of the impression that it couldn't have been that bad, but it was.
Yes. Yes.
It is quite remarkable, but fortunately there were people who survived, and there are many memoirs on the market which spell out exactly what happened, and unfortunately not the right people are reading them.
Yeah, that's true. I think that's one of the challenges of today, is that people either didn't go through World War II, obviously, or they're just so entitled because it's been easy since post-war, and they just can't contemplate that. And they think it's kind of, I don't know. I just read this book about walking away from hate, about a young woman. Well, she was a teen when she got into white power. And it's very much a cult. And it's growing. And I don't think that our schools have the ability, or they've really dedicated enough time to teach kids about really what happened.
Yeah, and there's a lot of places where the Holocaust is not part of the curriculum.
Yes.
I know in those who are local in Toronto, a new Holocaust museum is opening up in June, and it is geared towards children. So its function is purely educational. They expect to bring in many, many school trips, and it's sort of state of the art. They have because the survivor population is quickly disappearing.
Yes.
They interviewed, I believe it was 9 local Holocaust survivors. They asked them each about 3,000 questions, and they answered them. They've recorded it all, and so when kids go through the museum, there's displays, and there will be holograms of these survivors, and they can ask them questions. And using AI technology, they pick up
Oh, wow.
keywords that the kids mention, and they will respond. So, a kid might say, Gertrude, what was your home like before the war? And the hologram will answer it. So it's very much geared towards children, so that they can visually see and hear people talking about what their experience was like.
And where is this museum opening?
It's in North York, in the Lippa-Green building, which is in the Bathurst Sheppard area.
Okay.
Willie, are you involved in any meetings with high school kids? I mean, do any of the high schools reach out to you or groups you might be involved in?
The schools are using, for the time being, they are still using survivors, actual survivors, but they know that in a number of years there won't be any left. And I've met a few of them who are still doing it. They were all children during the war, and they're and they're still, I would say, in relatively good health, that they can get around and talk, and they have and they're very, very engaging, and so they'll continue to do that work. But at a certain point, they will go to the next generation, or the ones after that, because it's important that families know their parents or grandparents' story, because someone has to carry it on. But so I will do talks, say, at my synagogue. We don't have, our synagogue doesn't have that many survivors left either, only a small handful. And I might do other places as well, but the schools are still using survivors in Toronto. And there was because at one time there were about 25,000 survivors in Canada after the war. Most of them were in Toronto. So there's, I would venture to guess, maybe a couple hundred left, and many of them are quite old and not in great health either. So, and it is a real dilemma. And I think part of the reason why that museum that's opening up, the Holocaust Museum, was designed that way is it continues. It will, the voices will be heard by future generations, because they've been built right into the museum. So it's quite a genius design.
Yeah, I can send you a link. Well, if you want to share it, about 8 years ago, there was a woman who she's a filmmaker in Philadelphia, and she did about a 13-14-minute video. Her mother was a Holocaust survivor, and she went to different universities in Philadelphia. She went to Penn, she went to Temple, Drexel, she went up to Penn State, and just randomly stopped kids. This was just like 8 or 9 years ago. She did this video, and I'll send you the link. It's on YouTube so you could see it. And either they literally never heard of the Holocaust at all, literally never heard of it, or they had heard the word Holocaust, but had utterly no idea what it was. And this was 8 or 9 years ago. At the time, only 5 states in the U.S. had mandatory Holocaust education. I think now it's about 12 states in the U.S. But she would ask questions, and the ones who said they thought they may have heard it but had no idea what it was, had no idea like what country this was. They didn't even know if it was in Europe. They literally knew absolutely nothing at all. And one person said she thought it took place like 300 years ago or something. And I mean, it's really shocking, the total lack. As I said, others literally never even heard the word at all. So if you're interested, I could send you the link.
Yeah.
And then you can send it out to your group.
Now I can tell you that the numbers are no different in Canada.
Totally.
About 65% of young people know nothing about the Holocaust, or very, very little, and those numbers are growing. So and it's important for, not because it's important to Jewish people. It's important because because it was such a tragedy in our history, a history of humanity, and that you never want to see something like that happen again. And so people have to be aware of it. And in fact, genocide has continued to occur since World War II in many, many places. You know, in Bosnia, in Rwanda, the list goes on and on, and in Cambodia, the list goes on and on. So it's not like anybody has learned a lesson. Maybe nobody has set up the killing factories that the Nazis did. They were just uber efficient. But there's been a lot of genocide that's occurred around the globe. And so there's a lot of education that needs to be done.
Just history education in general. I mean, history shouldn't be an option in schools. It should be mandatory, right? You know, because if you forget your past, you know, you're doomed to repeat these things again and again, right? Yeah.
No, my belief in that is that even when people are aware of the past, they still repeat it because they have reason to do so, and they don't care about the past.
Well, yeah, but you have to reinforce it over and over and over again, you know. So anyway, but yeah, I mean, as a former history major, I mean, that's a big with me.
I find it's a great quote saying, if you don't know the past, you're doomed to repeat it. But I don't believe it's true.
Well, you don't know who you are either,
no.
Right? You know, there's a lot of things that if you don't know your past, you don't know. You know, I mean, I don't see how you can go forward in a positive way if you don't know your past, right? But
genocide occurs because there are people who believe they can get away with it. That's the only reason why. It's not because they are ignorant of the past. It's because they believe they get away with it.
Well, they get away with it because the population's ignorant of the past and lets them do it, right?
There's not democracy. It doesn't encourage democracy. So I think that's part of the reason why.
Yeah.
And let's just say, in a non-democratic society, sometimes you're fed a history that isn't exactly accurate.
Oh, that's an understatement. That is really an understatement.
So it's kind of sad when you see books being banned in the U.S. that actually might expand people's minds.
Yes. Well,
Oh, yeah, they don't. Yeah, they don't want to learn about the Black genocide in America now. That's being
No, you
Yeah.
don't want. You don't
no.
want.
you know.
Yeah, right. Because it's
Anyway,
it makes
Willie,
people uncomfortable.
Yeah.
yes. Oh God, heaven help us. They shouldn't feel uncomfortable.
And that genocide took place in a democracy.
Well, I don't know if America's a democracy, but there's a debate.
Well,
but,
they call it a democracy, so.
not for Black people. But anyway, Willie, I wanted to ask you, I know you concentrated your research on Poland because of your family history, but did you run across any studies or any research about Jewish partisans in Poland during the war? Like, did any of them kind of before the ghetto uprising, were there a lot of escapes from the ghetto into the woods, or did people organize, kind of?
There was often well, I wouldn't say with the partisans. The partisans were buried deep in the forest, and but there was resistance. There was an ongoing underground resistance, not just Jewish. A lot of it was non-Jewish. It was not Jewish at all, but there were people in the ghetto did get out and make contact with the underground. They smuggled in food. On occasions, there were arms too, but I mean, a lot of it had to do with finding food, because there was, and it also depended on the type of ghettos. That most of the ghettos were walled in, like in Warsaw. The big cities like Warsaw and Lodz had very physical barriers where it was very, very difficult to get out and escape. Where my father came from, that was not a walled ghetto, and the reason it was a little different was that it was also a major industrial region, and there were factories. There were a lot of factories, and that were in the region. It was a coal region as well, and they were all converted towards the war effort after the Germans invaded, and so a lot of the Jews in the town stayed there for a number of years until they decided to liquidate it, and worked in a lot of these factories. I know my cousin worked in one of these factories, and I think she made coats for the German army, and because of and people had to move in and out of the ghetto to get to the factories and things like that. So it wasn't walled in. People were restricted where they could, Jewish people were restricted where they could, what streets they could even move onto. But people, it was easy to sneak out then. If you were caught, you could end up being shot. But there were those who took a risk. In fact, my uncle's wife, he had 3 kids. He was sent away to a labor camp, but the family, his wife and 3 kids, 2 daughters and a son, they stuck around. They were around until the ghetto was liquidated in August '43. And during the final liquidation, the youngest, which was a boy, he snuck out of the ghetto because there was a family friend, a Pole, who at one point in the war told the family that they would help them. And so he snuck out. He actually snuck out during the liquidation and went to this Pole's house, and that they turned him away and said it was too dangerous, we can't help you. And so he was kind of like wandering around for a day or two. When the rest of the family was rounded up eventually and taken to the sort of a gathering place where they were shipping people away. We ran into him there. He had been gone for several days. So there was movement. There was movement in and out of the ghetto. It varied. It varied from city to city how restricted your movement was, but people did sneak out and made contact with the underground. Some escaped altogether and joined the partisan, for instance, but that was mostly young people. Somebody 50 years old, 60 years old, would not be able to do something like that. Anyone else? Okay.
I have a question that's off topic.
Yes.
Is that your sister?
Yes.
This is my sister, yes.
Yes.
I saw you in New York when Dove was on Broadway. I'm Kathy, Willie's friend from school.
Hi.
It was a long time ago.
That was a very long time ago. That little boy is 41 years old.
Oh, I'm sure.
And he was a little boy at the time.
He was adorable.
Okay.
Still is.
Just quickly, I'm going to stop the recording now. And how do I stop it? Did it?